Here is my ID. Chapter 1 is the learning to change. For some humans and species, learning to change is hard. I know for some it's a way of survival, and it can change the way someone behaves. For example, if a animal is used to warmer weather and is placed into an environment that's cold, in order to survive, they have to adapt to those changes in weather. It can be hard. Some may not survive, which is why you have to adapt to those changes. So a way of learning about this is natural selection. This was studied under Charles Darwin. And he read a book by Thomas Malthus called An Essay of Principal Population. This essentially studied how if resources are limited for a bigger population, that in order for the population to increase, you have to limit these supplies and resources. Chapter 2 is on the study of learning and behavior. This is kind of studying like the behavior in a scientific method like setting. So you're able to collect data, measure how someone is learning and whatnot. For example, there was a study done with rats, and the way that there was a study conducted and how fast it takes for a rat to learn how to get through a certain maze. So at the beginning of the trials, it took rats a minimum average of like 25 seconds or so to get through a maze, and then by the end of the last few trials, that average time declined in average. So this meant that it took, the more times the rat went through the maze, it was shorter for them to get through the maze. Chapter 3 is on Pavlovian conditioning. This is the study of classical conditioning, but can also be coined as Pavlovian conditioning because it was conducted under Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. He initially was studying the digestive system of dogs and the way they break down food, but through that study and experiment, he was able to notice that the salivary glands are one of the first few things that indicate breaking down of food, and how dogs are conditioned to produce saliva. All right, so chapter 4 is on the way that the Pavlovian conditioning is applied to real life manners. It's technically a reflexive behavior, meaning it's on reflex, meaning it just sort of happens without any like push or indication. It kind of just like happens. So a way of this is through certain different areas of research that Pavlov discussed, or at least this type of conditioning or application researched different areas of topics such as fear, prejudice, paraphilia, taste aversion, advertising, drug addiction, and healthcare. So I'm going to discuss, I'm not going to discuss all of them, so I'm going to pinpoint and discuss prejudice. So when we're put into like different social settings, prejudice kind of just occurs. Like, you know, we're quick to judge. You know, we judge a book by its cover in a literal and figurative manner. I know I am one to judge someone quickly without even thinking about, oh wait, is this okay? Probably not. So for example, I remember when I was little, I would be quick to judge someone by the way that they said they liked a certain food. I thought, this person loves pickles. I don't like pickles. So automatically I'm like, oh, I don't like this person just because of their, like, the reason why they liked pickles. But after getting to know them and everything, I figured out, wait, I actually have some things in common with this person, so I really shouldn't be too quick to judge. It's kind of like a conditioned emotional response to hearing something about that person. Right now I'm going to be discussing operant learning. This is the kind of experience or procedure that allows behavior to become stronger or weaker So the person who kind of founded operant learning is E.L. Thorndike. There's this law of effect that created or was the foundation for operant learning. He kind of called this relationship between behavior and consequences the law of effect, which identified 4 key elements: environment, in which the behavior occurs, the change in the environment, the behavior, and the change in the behavior produced by that consequence. Essentially saying that the behavior is due to the environment. The reason why someone acted this way was because of the environment. This can be said in a lot of real-world examples. So right now we're going to be discussing Chapter 6, which is the reinforcement of behavior, but beyond habits. This is kind of another way of like shaping new behavior. So for example, I work with little kids, specifically like 2-year-olds. So the kind of behavior that we're trying to shape for them to do without us actively like reminding them, or repetition, is saying please and thank you, to play nicely with their friends, to have manners, to be kind to one another. Of course, we develop certain plans that are age appropriate and developmentally sound. A lot of times this does help, and sometimes there are certain behaviors that are beyond our expertise that require certain specialists to shape certain behavior that we are not qualified to do, using data and different methods. This can be like ABA therapy, which is like another way of like conducting certain tests and keeping track of data in order to in order to reinforce certain behavior. Chapter 7 is the schedules of reinforcement, and by this point we're able to like have a pattern to reinforce certain learning tasks, and with a pattern we're able to give like a certain interval of like, okay, let's start doing this in order to develop a pattern of behavior in a classroom environment or in a social environment. This allows us to, or allows psychologists to interpret certain patterns using schedules of reinforcement, schedule effects with learning, and with continuous reinforcement, which is CRF. It like reinforces the behavior every time that it occurs. Like anytime a child is able to do a homework assignment without much assistance in a correct manner, they're praised. Or every time that a child earns a good grade on an assignment, they're praised. So it continually reinforces good behavior. Then we can go into Chapter 8, which is the operant learning, but more specifically with punishment. Reinforcement is necessary in order to provide certain quality in our life. So there's like a few kinds of punishments. There's positive punishments, which is when kids are like being punished in a manner of like physical pain, like a spanking. So now we're kind of diving into the end of the series. I'm going to be discussing Chapter 9, which is operant applications, and this is when operant procedures are kind of applied, hence the term applications, into different environments such as schools, home, and also in the clinical setting. So as discussed in the textbook, there are differences of operants being applied in an orphanage than in a home. In a home, typically a home is more responsive to certain behavior rather than an orphanage. Orphanages are unfortunately overrun. There's a multitude of children and only so much help. Whereas in a home, it's more secluded into the familiar environment. Typically in a family setting or in a home setting, with constant responsiveness from the parents, there's typically improvement in certain behavior, but that's not always the case. In a school setting, you could also say that this is also the behavior and responsiveness can be different depending on a more prestigious school than in a low-income school. It all depends on the quality of education and training of the teachers and those in the leadership position, as well as the quality of material and resources available to the families and educators and staff. And then, of course, you have the clinical setting. Of course, in a clinical setting, you have psychiatrists, psychologists, those with higher education degrees, resources, who are able to study and take note of certain learning or operant learning and treatments that are typically associated with like certain behaviors, such as self-injury, delusions, and paralysis. Sometimes with self-injury, you tend to see that type of behavior with children of developmental disorders such as autism, those with developmental delays. I do remember when I worked with a student who was on the spectrum but was not fully officially diagnosed. He's now officially diagnosed. But when at the time that I was teaching the child would self-injure themselves by repeatedly banging their head against the floor and on the wall. This was something that was noted by myself and other educators, as well as the mother, when asked about that certain behavior, if it occurs in a home setting, and it did. Later to come find out, the child ended up being diagnosed with autism. And any of delusions, I know, for example, those with Alzheimer's or schizophrenia tend to have that belief that someone's out to get them. And then the final countdown. We have Chapter 10, which is observational learning. And this is how learning certain behavior is observed through experience, such as social observational learning. And this is typically when you observe a behavior of another person, but you're actually present during that time of behavior. So a lot of times, as a preschool teacher, I'm able to observe certain behavior in the classroom setting and take note of that. And then another kind of observational learning is asocial observational learning, and this is learning from observed events, like while not being in present of that certain behavior at that time that the behavior is observed. So for example, if you're in a building or in a room, you're not observing any behavior because you're the only person, but there are other people like behind a glass wall that you cannot see that are observing the behavior that you're exhibiting.